On October 15, 1895, photographer Marcus Webb was hired by the Blackwood Workhouse in Lancashire, England, to document the excellent care provided to unfortunate children. One photograph showed two young brothers, Thomas and Edward Hartley, ages 11 and 8, standing together with Edward's arms wrapped around his older brother in what appeared to be a loving embrace. Marcus filed it away as evidence of the institution's compassion. In 2019, 124 years later, digital restoration specialist Dr. Sarah Chen was hired to preserve Lancashire's historical photographs. When she magnified the Hartley brothers' image to 12,800%, what emerged from the pixels made her physically ill. Because the embrace wasn't about love, it was about terror. And the details hidden in that photograph would expose one of Victorian England's darkest secrets. Before we reveal what those pixels showed, subscribe now. Because what you're about to learn will shatter everything you thought you knew about historical photography and the lies institutions tell. Thomas and Edward Hartley became orphans on March 3, 1895, when their mother, Catherine Hartley, died of consumption in a Manchester tenement. Their father had died 2 years earlier in a factory accident, crushed between machinery at the Ashton Cotton Mill, where he worked 14-hour shifts for 8 shillings a week. Catherine had tried desperately to keep her sons fed and housed, taking in laundry, sewing piecework by candlelight, sometimes going without food for days so Thomas and Edward could eat. But consumption doesn't care about sacrifice. By February 1895, Catherine could no longer work. She could barely breathe. Her sister, Margaret Clark, visited on March 2nd and found Catherine skeletal, fevered, coughing blood into rags. "The boys," Catherine whispered, gripping Margaret's hand with what little strength remained. "Promise me. Don't let them go to the workhouse. Please. Anything but that." Margaret promised. But Margaret was married to a man who worked in the coal mines and already had 6 children of their own in a 2-room cottage. There was no space for Thomas and Edward, no money to feed 2 more mouths. Catherine died the next morning. Thomas held her hand while Edward sobbed into her blanket. They were 11 and 8 years old, and they understood that everything was about to change. Margaret tried. She went to 3 other relatives, all refused. Times were hard. Families were large. 2 orphaned boys were a burden no one could afford. "I'm sorry," Margaret told Thomas on March 8th, tears streaming down her face. "I tried everything. The only place that will take you both is Blackwood Workhouse. But Thomas, listen to me. You must protect Edward. The stories I've heard about that place." She stopped, unable to continue. "What stories?" Thomas asked, his jaw set with the premature hardness of a child forced to become a man. "Just protect him, no matter what. Promise me." "I promise." The Blackwood Workhouse for the poor and indigent stood on the outskirts of Burnley, a 3-story stone building that looked more like a prison than a charitable institution, which, in truth, was exactly what it was. The workhouse system was supposed to provide shelter and food for the destitute. In reality, it was designed to be so unpleasant that people would do anything to avoid it. The theory was that harsh conditions would motivate the poor to find work and stop being a burden on society. But Thomas and Edward weren't adults who could find work. They were children, and Blackwood Workhouse, under the management of Mr. Harold Grimshaw, had a particular reputation for cruelty toward children. 3 people warned Margaret not to send the boys there. Mrs. Porter, who ran the corner shop, pulled Margaret aside. "My cousin worked there as a nurse. She quit after 3 months, said she couldn't stomach what they did to the children. Beatings for the smallest infractions. Starvation rations. Children forced to work 12 hours in the oakum shed, picking apart old rope until their fingers bled. Father Davies from St. Mary's Church visited Margaret at her cottage. Please reconsider Blackwood. There are other workhouses. Farther away, yes, but less severe. Grimshaw runs that place like a tyrant. Last year, 2 children died there, officially recorded as pneumonia and scarlet fever. But there were whispers. And Samuel Brooks, who delivered coal to Blackwood, told Margaret bluntly, "Don't send those boys there unless you want them broken or dead. I've seen children loading coal with bruises covering their arms and legs. I've heard screaming from the punishment rooms. That place isn't Christian charity. It's a torture house with a Bible verse painted above the door." But Margaret had no choice. No other institution would take both brothers. Splitting them up seemed even crueler than sending them to Blackwood together. On March 10, 1895, Thomas and Edward Hartley were admitted to Blackwood Workhouse. The intake record preserved in Lancashire archives reads, 2 male children ages 11 and 8, orphans, no living relatives able to provide care, assigned to Boys Ward C, expected duration, indefinite, neither boy ever left. 6 months after Thomas and Edward's admission, the Blackwood Workhouse received notice that an inspector from the Poor Law Board would be conducting a routine visit. Harold Grimshaw, the workhouse master, was furious. Inspections were supposed to be unannounced, but someone at the board, probably that bleeding heart reformer George Lansbury, had started giving advance notice to allow workhouses to present themselves appropriately. Grimshaw knew what that meant. Hide the evidence. Clean up the children. Stage scenes of institutional compassion. For 3 days before the inspector's October 14th arrival, conditions at Blackwood changed dramatically. The usual watery gruel was supplemented with actual vegetables. The children were given extra water rations to wash. The oakum shed, where children spent hours picking apart tarred rope, destroying their hands in the process, was closed for repairs. Most importantly, Grimshaw ordered the punishment room emptied. Thomas Hartley was dragged out of isolation, where he'd spent 72 hours after being caught stealing a piece of bread for his brother. The nurse, Mrs. Abigail Stone, cleaned Thomas's face and checked his arms. She inhaled sharply. The boy's forearms were covered in bruises, purple, yellow, green, in various stages of healing. Fingerprint-shaped marks where he'd been grabbed, longer marks where he'd been struck with a cane. "Pull your sleeves down," she whispered urgently. "All the way down. Button them at the wrist. Do not roll them up for any reason tomorrow. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, his gray eyes hollow. 6 months in Blackwood had taught him to obey without question. Edward was in better physical condition. Thomas had been taking punishments meant for his younger brother, intercepting blame, accepting beatings to spare the 8-year-old. But Edward was psychologically shattered. He barely spoke. He flinched at sudden movements. At night, he had nightmares that made him scream until Thomas held him. Inspector Martin Whitmore arrived at 10 o'clock on October 15th. He was a decent man, genuinely concerned about workhouse conditions, but he was also overworked, responsible for inspecting 23 institutions across Lancashire. He had 4 hours at Blackwood before he needed to catch a train to his next inspection. Grimshaw showed him the cleanest wards, the best-fed children, the newest equipment. Everything was staged, scripted, a performance of institutional competence. "I'd like to document the excellent conditions," Whitmore said. For my report. Do you have a photographer available? Grimshaw smiled. I've already arranged it, Inspector. Marcus Webb is waiting in the assembly hall. Marcus Webb was a local photographer who did occasional work for institutions and businesses. He'd photographed Blackwood once before, 3 years earlier, and the images had been used in fundraising materials to show donors how their money was being well spent. Grimshaw selected 10 children for the photographs, the ones who looked healthiest, who could be trusted not to cry or collapse during the session. Thomas and Edward were among them, dressed in their cleanest uniforms, hair combed, faces scrubbed. You two, Grimshaw said, pointing at the brothers. Stand together. You, he gestured to Edward, put your arms around your brother. Show the inspector how well children bond here through our caring environment. Edward looked at Thomas with terrified eyes. Thomas gave a tiny nod. It's okay. Just do what he says. Edward wrapped his arms around Thomas's waist and pressed his face against his brother's chest. To Marcus Webb, looking through his camera lens, it appeared to be a tender moment. A younger brother seeking comfort from an older sibling. Marcus positioned his camera on the tripod and adjusted the focus. Hold that position. Don't move. Exposure will be 8 seconds. The shutter opened. Thomas stood rigid, Edward clinging to him. 8 seconds that would preserve this moment for 124 years. 8 seconds that captured far more than Marcus Webb could see with his naked eye. Dr. Sarah Chen had been restoring historical photographs for 12 years, but the Lancashire Historical Photograph Project was her most ambitious undertaking yet. The project, funded by the UK National Lottery Heritage Fund, aimed to digitize and restore 10,000 photographs from Lancashire archives dating from 1850 to 1920. Sarah had processed hundreds of images, factory workers, street scenes, family portraits, civic events. On August 3, 2019, she opened file LHP 4472, Blackwood Workhouse, October 1895, Children in Assembly Hall. At standard resolution, it showed what the metadata described. Orphaned children in institutional care. Most stood in rows, expressionless. But one photograph in the collection immediately caught Sarah's attention. 2 boys, one older and one younger, in an embrace. The younger boy's arms wrapped around the older one. Faces turned toward the camera. The image had been labeled Example of Sibling Affection Maintained in Institutional Care. Something about the photograph bothered Sarah. She couldn't articulate what, exactly. Just an instinct developed over years of looking at faces in old photographs, an ability to read expressions that most people missed. She began the restoration process. First, removing dust and scratches using specialized software. Then adjusting contrast and sharpness. The glass plate negative had been well preserved, which meant high-resolution scanning could recover extraordinary detail. Sarah magnified the image to 400%, then 800%, then 1,600%. At 3,200%, she started seeing things that stopped her breath. The older boy's hands hanging at his sides. They weren't relaxed. They were trembling, visible as motion blur even in the 8-second exposure. His fingers were clenched, knuckles white. At 6,400%, the boy's sleeves came into focus. Dark stains at the cuffs. Not dirt. Wrong color. Wrong texture. Sarah had seen enough Victorian photographs to recognize dried blood. At 96%, she magnified the older boy's face. The expression she'd initially read as serious or stoic resolved into something else entirely. Eyes too wide, jaw too tight. The facial expression of someone in physical pain trying desperately not to show it. At 12,800%, the maximum resolution her equipment could achieve. Sarah zoomed in on the boy's left forearm, where the sleeve had ridden up slightly, perhaps half an inch, during the exposure. There, in stunning clarity revealed by pixel-level analysis, were unmistakable bruises, dark marks, fingerprints, the distinctive pattern of a hand gripping flesh hard enough to leave contusions. Sarah pushed back from her computer and ran to the bathroom, where she vomited. When she returned to her desk, hands shaking, she forced herself to examine the rest of the photograph with the same forensic detail. The younger boy's face, pressed against his brother's chest, also not relaxed. Muscles in his neck and jaw were tense. His small hands clutched the fabric of his brother's uniform with desperate force. And there was something else. Something Sarah almost missed until she adjusted the angle and lighting in her software. On the older boy's neck, just visible above the collar, was a circular mark, approximately 1 inch in diameter, the exact size and shape of the mark left by a cane strike. Sarah opened the historical records associated with the photograph. The boys were identified: Thomas Hartley, age 11, Edward Hartley, age 8. Brothers. Admitted March 1895. She searched for their names in the Blackwood Workhouse Records database. Thomas Hartley. Discharged December 1895. Reason: run away during night, not recovered. Edward Hartley. Died November 21st, 1895. Cause of death: pneumonia. 6 weeks after this photograph was taken, the younger boy was dead. Sarah Chen picked up her phone and called the Lancashire Archives Historical Research Department. "I need to speak to someone about Blackwood Workhouse," she said, her voice unsteady. "I think I've found evidence of child abuse, and I think there's been a cover-up for 124 years. Sarah Chen's phone call triggered an investigation that would occupy 6 researchers for 8 months. The Lancashire Archives contained extensive records from Blackwood Workhouse: admission logs, financial ledgers, death certificates, correspondence, and inspector reports. But these official documents painted a picture of institutional competence and appropriate care. It was the unofficial records, documents that had been misfiled, overlooked, or deliberately hidden, that told a different story. Dr. Robert Ashford, senior archivist at Lancashire Archives, had worked with these records for 30 years. When Sarah showed him the magnified photograph, his immediate response was, "I need to pull the inquiry files." "What inquiry files?" Sarah asked. In 1896, there was a parliamentary inquiry into conditions at several Lancashire workhouses, including Blackwood. It was triggered by a series of anonymous letters sent to George Lansbury, the social reformer. The inquiry was inconclusive, officially. But the witness testimonies were sealed for 100 years. They became public in 1996. Nobody's really looked at them since. Robert retrieved Box 47J from secure storage. Inside were 400 pages of testimony from the 1896 Lansbury Inquiry into Workhouse Conditions. Testimony of Mrs. Abigail Stone, nurse, Blackwood Workhouse, February 12, 1896. "I cannot remain silent any longer." The photograph that Inspector Whitmore included in his October 1895 report shows 2 brothers, Thomas and Edward Hartley. That photograph is a lie. Those boys were not well cared for. Thomas had been in isolation for 3 days before that photograph. He'd been beaten so severely that I feared internal injuries. Mr. Grimshaw ordered me to clean him up and ensure the bruises didn't show. Edward, the younger boy, was terrified constantly. He barely ate. He had nightmares every night. Thomas protected him as much as he could, taking punishments meant for Edward. When Edward died in November, the death certificate said pneumonia. That's technically true. His lungs filled with fluid. But the pneumonia was caused by malnutrition, cold, and the weakened state of a child who'd been systematically abused for 8 months. Testimony of Samuel Brooks, coal delivery worker, February 14th, 1896. I delivered coal to Blackwood twice weekly for 5 years. I saw things that made me sick. Children with bruises. Children so thin you could count their ribs. In September 1895, I saw a boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, loading coal into the shed. His hands were bleeding. When I asked if he was all right, Mr. Grimshaw appeared and told me to mind my business. That boy vanished a few months later. I later learned his name was Thomas Hartley. He ran away in December. Nobody ever found him. Testimony of Father Edward Davies, St. Mary's Church, February 18th, 1896. I conducted the funeral service for Edward Hartley in November 1895. He was 8 years old. He weighed approximately 40 pounds, at least 15 pounds underweight for his age. The undertaker, Mr. Mills, showed me the body privately and pointed out extensive bruising on the child's back and legs. He said it was inconsistent with death by pneumonia alone. I reported this to the Poor Law Board. No action was taken. Most damning was a letter discovered in Harold Grimshaw's personal correspondence, dated October 20th, 1895, 5 days after the photograph was taken. The inspection was a complete success. Whitmore saw exactly what I wanted him to see. The photographs will be useful for fundraising. The board is satisfied. We can return to normal operations. The Hartley boys caused considerable trouble during preparations, but they've been appropriately disciplined. The younger one is showing signs of illness, but I expect he'll recover or be removed from the roles soon enough. Edward died 1 month later. Thomas disappeared 6 weeks after that. For 124 years, no one knew what happened to Thomas Hartley after he ran away from Blackwood Workhouse in December 1895. But in October 2019, 3 months after Sarah Chen began her investigation, a woman named Margaret Preston contacted the Lancashire Archives. "I saw the news story about the Blackwood photograph," Margaret said on the phone. "I think my great-great-grandfather might be one of those boys." Margaret's great-great-grandfather was named Thomas Hartley. He'd never spoken about his childhood, except to say that he'd been orphaned young and had a difficult time before finding better circumstances. He'd changed his surname to Preston when he enlisted in the military in 1900, possibly to avoid being returned to institutional care. Margaret provided photographs of Thomas as an adult, an elderly man in the 1950s, surrounded by grandchildren, smiling, but with eyes that held decades of unspoken pain. Sarah compared the 1895 photograph with images of Thomas Preston in later life. Facial recognition software, accounting for age progression, returned a 94% probability match. Thomas Hartley had survived. He'd escaped Blackwood at age 11 in the middle of winter and somehow made his way to Liverpool, where he'd been taken in by a merchant ship captain who needed a cabin boy. He'd spent his teenage years at sea enlisted in the army at age 16 by lying about his age, and eventually settled in Southampton, where he worked as a dock worker, married, and raised 4 children. He never spoke about Edward. His children and grandchildren didn't even know he'd had a brother. But Margaret found something in Thomas's effects after researching her family history. A small leather journal written in 1948 when Thomas was 64 years old. He'd been ill and apparently felt compelled to finally document what happened. The journal entry dated March 15, 1948. "I am an old man now, and maybe I should let the past stay buried. But I see Eddie's face every night when I close my eyes. He was 8 years old, and he died because I couldn't protect him. I promised Mum I would protect him. I promised Aunt Margaret I would protect him. I failed. Blackwood Workhouse killed my little brother as surely as if they'd put a knife in him. They starved him, beat him, worked him until he couldn't stand, and when he got sick, they let him die. I ran away because I knew I was next. I was a coward. I left Eddie's grave behind, and I've carried that guilt for 53 years. If there's a God, I hope he punishes the men who ran that place. I hope they suffered the way Eddie suffered." The journal, combined with the photograph, the inquiry testimonies, and Sarah's digital restoration work, was presented to the UK Parliament's Historical Injustices Committee in March 2020. On November 21, 2020, exactly 125 years after Edward Hartley's death, Parliament passed the Historical Institutional Abuse, Recognition and Remedies Act 2020, nicknamed the Hartley Act. The law did 3 things. First, it established a formal process for investigating historical cases of institutional child abuse and issuing posthumous acknowledgments to victims. Second, it created a national database of workhouse records, residential schools, and other institutions, making it easier for researchers and descendants to access historical evidence. Third, it provided funding for memorials and educational programs ensuring that the victims of institutional abuse would never be forgotten. The law was imperfect. It couldn't bring Edward back, couldn't erase Thomas's trauma, couldn't punish the men who'd committed these crimes. But it was recognition. It was acknowledgement. It was the government finally saying, "This happened. It was wrong. We remember." On October 15, 2021, exactly 126 years after Marcus Webb took the photograph, a memorial was unveiled at the site of the former Blackwood Workhouse. The building itself had been demolished in 1952. The land had become a small public park in Burnley, unremarkable except for a single stone wall that had been preserved from the original structure. The memorial was a bronze sculpture. 2 boys, one older and one younger, standing together. The older boy's hand rests protectively on the younger one's shoulder. Both face forward, looking toward a future they never got to see. The inscription reads, "In memory of Edward Hartley, 1887 to 1895, and Thomas Hartley, 1884 to 1957, and all children who suffered in institutional care. Edward died here age 8. Thomas survived but carried the wounds forever. May we never forget. May we never repeat." Sarah Chen attended the unveiling, along with Margaret Preston and 3 of Thomas's great-great-grandchildren. Over 200 people came: historians, activists, descendants of other workhouse victims, local residents, and school children whose classes had studied the Hartley case as part of the national curriculum. The photograph, both the original version and Sarah's restored, magnified version, was displayed on informational panels around the memorial. Visitors could see the progression, the image as it appeared in 1895, hiding its secrets, the image as it appears now, revealing the truth. This photograph taught us something crucial, Sarah said during the dedication ceremony. It taught us that historical images aren't neutral documents. They were created by people with agendas, motivations, and often something to hide. The Victorian era left us thousands of photographs of orphanages, workhouses, and institutions, all showing clean children in orderly environments. How many of those photographs are lies? How many hide abuse behind staged smiles and forced embraces? The memorial receives approximately 5,000 visitors per year. Many leave flowers, white roses for Edward, red roses for Thomas. Some leave notes. You deserved better. We remember you. This should never have happened. The photograph itself resides in 2 locations. The original glass plate negative is in the Lancashire Archives, carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage. Sarah Chen's digitally restored version is displayed in the National Justice Museum in Nottingham as part of their Hidden Histories: What Photographs Don't Tell Us exhibition. The exhibition includes detailed explanations of the restoration process, showing how digital technology can reveal what our ancestors' eyes missed or deliberately ignored. It's become one of the museum's most popular exhibits, particularly among school groups studying Victorian social history. In 2023, the BBC produced a documentary titled The Hartley Brothers: A Photograph's Secret. It was viewed by 4.2 million people and nominated for a BAFTA. The documentary included interviews with Sarah Chen, Margaret Preston, historians, and digital forensics experts who explained how pixels can preserve evidence of crimes long after the perpetrators have died. Thomas Hartley died in 1957, age 73, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved him. He'd built a good life from terrible beginnings. But Margaret Preston, his great-great-granddaughter, said something at the memorial unveiling that captured the tragedy perfectly. My great-great-grandfather survived Blackwood, but a part of him died there with Eddie. He carried that trauma for 62 years. He never spoke about it. He never healed. The memorial isn't just for Eddie, who died. It's for Thomas, who survived, but never really escaped. And it's for all of us who carry the inherited trauma of what was done to our ancestors in the name of charity. Edward Hartley was 8 years old when he died. He loved his brother. He was afraid of the dark. He died cold, hungry, and in pain in an institution that was supposed to care for him. Thomas Hartley was 11 years old when he lost the only family he had left. He ran away into winter darkness and somehow survived. He built a life. But he never stopped seeing his brother's face. The photograph shows an embrace. What it really shows is a boy trying desperately to protect his brother from a world determined to break them both. 124 years later, we finally see the truth. We finally acknowledge what happened. We finally say their names. Thomas and Edward Hartley. They mattered. Their pain mattered. Their story mattered. And the photograph that once hid their suffering now ensures they'll never be forgotten. The memorial stands in Burnley, Lancashire. Visit to pay your respects. Subscribe to learn more stories of those history tried to silence.